Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to a video that should have come out a long time ago. Because before Baldur's Gate 3 showed up and made sure everyone was paying attention to the cRPG niche, there were plenty of good cRPGs that came out in between now and all the ones people are nostalgic for. So before we inevitably see to Baldur's Gate 3, let's take the time to look at one of those which I played to completion a few years ago. To that end, it's rather fitting that the current game on the chopping block would be Pillars of Eternity, as it proved to be an excellent starting point as I began looking beyond the Infinity Engine games. Not only are the appearance and a lot of the gameplay quirks from the Infinity Engine still present, it's a game by Obsidian, back when Chris Avellone was at the studio. And when you've got the lead writer for Planescape Torment and Knights of the Old Republic 2 on your team, it doesn't get much better than that. With that in mind, let's not waste any time and jump right into it, starting with the combat system. The game uses a custom system that has a lot of similarity to Dungeons & Dragons, but makes a fair number of deviations. Before we go into detail, I'm of two minds about this. On one hand, not drawing from a pre-existing rule set means that there's a higher learning curve for this game in particular, at least comparatively speaking. On the other hand, needing to abide by an existing rule set can possibly hamstring the kind of game you can make, as you end up needing to make the game in service of the rule set, instead of the rule set being in service of the game. In this case, it makes sense why they diverged, but it did lead to a bit of a learning curve while figuring out the nuances between a druid from D&D versus this game's interpretation of the class. To go into more detail, the basic attributes have been modified a little. A lot of them are functionally similar, even if the names are a little different, but two of them are significant deviations. One of them is Perception, which replaces Wisdom as a means to perceive how a character is acting, and in gameplay terms affects your accuracy and how well you can sense danger. Another is Resolve, which focuses the charisma statistic on your personal drive instead of also including physical appearance. The remaining four are pretty close parallels to prior ones, with all of them influencing pretty much every number in this game, whether it be your ability to deflect or dodge attacks, your ability to remain focused on a spell if you get hit mid-cast, or your ability to hit with a particular weapon. In all of these, the UI does a good job at explaining exactly what's affected by each, meaning you're able to make an informed decision before you even step into gameplay. To further alter these, you have a variety of playable races, which reflect the kind of people you can find in the world. Along with your usual humans, elves, and dwarves, you also have the Aumaua, a tall people who typically have some kind of affinity for water, Orlins, who are a shorter people that are often at home in forests and ancient ruins, and what the game calls godlike, those who bear some kind of physical resemblance to one of the gods. Each of these has a small impact on your attributes and may have story ramifications as well, especially since you're able to pick from where in the world your character hails from. With this outlined, you then have the classes, with a lot of them being typical of a D&D campaign. There are subtle variations, such as the druid being focused on damage and support over healing, but for the most part, if you've heard of a class, then you can follow along pretty easily. One major difference, however, is the addition of two classes, with these fitting more into the setting of the world. One of them is a chanter, which is the closest thing this game has to a bard. The reason it's worth treating as its own entity is that it handles spellcasting far differently, with the character constantly chanting hymns that can then be translated into unique spells. This leads them to favor longer engagements, as their decent resilience in martial combat ensures that they can stay alive long enough to throw out something useful eventually. The second unique class is the Cipher, which will tie directly into the world building we'll be discussing. Without getting too far into that yet, the world is one where study of the soul is front and center, with ciphers being able to directly contact and manipulate the souls of others. This is then channeled into powerful spells, whether it be direct damage or something more dangerous like mind control. Because of this, they don't use spell slots in the way a wizard might, but instead build up focus that is then channeled into those spells. With these new inclusions, you end up with some really cool ways for a character to play, to where I didn't even notice the absence of multiclassing until long after I had finished playing the game. It's not something that would make sense for the setting, and considering how individually powerful a given class can be, it's not really necessary. As we move to talk about combat, it's worth mentioning the different difficulty levels. Since that not everyone will be entering this game with a good knowledge of how cRPGs work, now that you're still listening after how dense the prior descriptions were, they have an explicit easy mode if you wish to take your time learning the mechanics. And if you're hopeless at this kind of game, they also have a game journalist mode. My typical approach to choosing difficulty is to go one level above normal, at least for genres I'm familiar with, as that's usually where the developers take the gloves off, and force me to use every trick at my disposal. As it turns out, the game agrees with me, as the description for hard mode is that it's designed for Infinity Engine veterans. Considering I had last played Icewind Dale 2 and Knights of the Old Republic within months of starting this one, I'd say that was an apt description, as there were definitely fights where I had to pull out all the stops to make it through. One moment that comes to mind was near the end of the White March DLC, where I spent an hour trying and failing to get past a really tough fight. In order to get past it, I decided to call it a night, spent a decent chunk of time looking through the crafting system I had otherwise neglected, and made sure to bring party members who were better suited for the kind of fight we were up against. They also included a hardcore mode, because there's bound to be at least one psychopath out there crazy enough to try that, especially if he's also crazy enough to pair that with the souped up encounters you get from Path of the Damned difficulty. Getting into combat itself, this is where a lot of people nowadays will instantly tune out, the fact that it's using real time with pause. I'm not someone who hates the system, but I am slowly starting to turn on it. For the unfamiliar, real time with pause means that combat happens in real time, but you can pause at any point to give orders and assess the current situation. This then means instead of worrying about who moves first, you instead worry about whose move is faster, whether you can interrupt someone's attack with your own, and so on. On paper, it's a neat deviation from the turn-based combat you find in a tabletop RPG, but in practice, there are noticeable flaws. For one thing, in a game with a complex rule set, it can become much more difficult to process what's going on and to properly respond to an opponent's move. There are a ton of status effects like frightened, disoriented, and blinded that don't directly stop actions but do affect back-end statistics, and therefore affect how useful your units are. Since the multiple status effects can be layered on top of each other, and since the listed actions in the bottom right corner can get very messy even if you expand the combat log, it can be hard to figure out what caused the effect, when it occurred, or to know how it will directly translate for a particular character. There's so much going on that you don't usually have time to notice whether someone's under a particular stat-altering effect, but instead whether they're stunned, confused, or dominated, because you'll notice those pretty quickly when that unit can't be bossed around. Second, it also makes AoE attacks much more of a liability. With a turn-based system, you may still have cases of friendly fire, but those are usually a result of role-playing, calculated risks, or a simple lack of familiarity. All three of which I've experienced firsthand thanks to a certain bard in one campaign my friends and I wrapped up a few years ago. In this game, it's almost entirely accidental when an AoE effect hits an ally, which means unless it can be thrown out in a hurry like the wizard's fireball spell, or it doesn't affect allies like the druid's lightning spells, significant parts of the spell list can end up being detrimental. All of these drawbacks then get compounded whenever the game has problems managing itself. Once you have a full party, you'll sometimes have issues with characters being unable to get past each other, which can mean even when you have the perfect strategy mapped out, you have to tell your mage to stop casting something just so the fighter or paladin can do his job, with this being a really obnoxious problem in narrow hallways. And yes, I'm aware they added a beta version for a turn-based mode recently, but if it takes you over 10 years to add that in, you'll forgive me for being skeptical of its viability. To make these limitations even more tragic, the encounters themselves were really well designed. What stood out initially was how health and resting were handled, as both of those dictate how long you can spend on a given excursion. While each character has a health bar, you also have to consider your endurance bar, or the maximum health you can take into a given fight. This endurance is then replenished from the character's health when they're healed or at the end of an encounter, which places a hard limit on how long you can stall a fight for. Even if you have all of the healing spells in the world, eventually you will run out of health and will need to rest. As far as resting is concerned, there's no random encounters that occur in the middle of it, but you have a hard limit on how often you can do so, with that limit being greater or lesser depending on the difficulty level. For hard mode, I could only carry enough camping supplies to rest twice, meaning despite not having to worry about inventory space, there were times I was compelled to return to a stronghold or inn before continuing on. Though this might seem like an inconvenience at first, there's a hidden benefit to it, as it neatly carves out time where you can assess the loot you've collected and gives you an opportunity to gain some unique buffs from resting at a particular place, such as a temporary attribute increase or flat damage reduction. It also helps the developers manage the difficulty curve, as then they know you're likely to stop by the taverns and inns, making them an ideal place to put quest givers. Getting back to combat, the enemy variety is stellar, with enough customization built into your units to where you can realistically handle anything thrown at you. You're even able to recruit adventurers at any point, and while the maximum starting level of any new recruit is capped at 1 below your self-insert, it allows you to min-max combat encounters the same way you could in Icewind Dale. Even if you think you've made a mistake with how a character is set up, you also have the option to respec your current party members, allowing you to retool them to deal with a particularly dangerous section. These aren't features that can be heavily abused, as you need to stop by an inn to do both, but it means that there aren't as many cases where you can get ruined by a build decision, a fact that's really valuable considering how long a single playthrough can last. There's also a good amount of loot, and some really interesting decisions to make with respect to which weapons to use for what circumstance, which makes it a min-maxer's dream. Also, to help deal with the issues of real time with pause, the party AI is surprisingly intelligent. Each class has presets that focus on everything from direct damage to crowd control to healing, which will lead them to favor certain abilities over others. You also have some control over how aggressive or defensive a particular unit is, with them either just retaliating against enemy attacks or aggressively seeking out opponents, though choosing the latter may mean they run headlong into your AoE spells, which might explain why I didn't tend to favor them. Another appreciated touch is that skills that require a rest to recharge have a toggle, which means you have some control over how seriously you wish the AI to take a particular encounter. The only problem I have with that part is the user interface, as it's not a quick process to switch around party AI due to all of the nested menus. For party AI, clicking once enables or disables it, while clicking twice allows you to modify it. However, doing that for every party member, all to tick one box for each, can be time consuming, to where I wish there was a way to have all of my party AI laid out in a single window. Perhaps if I wanted that much granular control, I would just turn the party AI off and play manually, but as far as I can tell, there's no way to chain actions together, and with 6 of these guys to manage, it can end up being a lot for even a single fight. I already made the mistake of not relying on party AI for the Infinity Engine games, and had no intention of subjecting myself to that again, especially with how chaotic both Icewind Dale games could get. As for the rest of the interface, it's set up pretty sensibly, with information laid out well while also giving a decent amount of freedom to move elements around. They even have keywords highlighted whenever they appear, which means if you forget the effect that strength or perception have, you can just click the word and be reminded of that in an instant. But then there's the performance. Before I get too far, I should say that the game performed pretty well on my PC. That's to be expected considering when I built my PC and what I put in it, but for moment-to-moment gameplay, it works just fine. The only issue I ran into was when I tried to have another memory-intensive task going on at the same time, such as compressing raw video footage, at which point the frame rate would sometimes be choppy. Other than that though, I have no complaints about standard gameplay. However, while it has the look and feel of the Infinity Engine, the game is actually using the Unity Engine, which is a double-edged sword. On one hand, the Infinity Engine has a lot of silly quirks to it, by virtue of it being developed alongside the original Baldur's Gate, such as the fact that game speed was tied to frame rate. Nowadays we know that's a bad idea, and it'd be nice if someone could remind Nintendo of that, but moving away from the Infinity Engine was certainly the right move. The problem, however, is that Unity was not an ideal replacement. Just to be clear, I have no inherent issue with Unity as an engine, as it certainly has its uses. For smaller scale projects like Hollow Knight, it can work incredibly well, and I even considered using it for my own experiments at one point. However, I question the logic of using it for a cRPG, as older Unity especially has a nasty habit of struggling whenever it has to manage a lot of stuff at once. As an example, if any of you have played Hearthstone, remember when the power creep got really bad and you'd have 1,000,005 things fire off at once, which would seemingly make the game chug? Yeah, imagine that, but interacting with a single inventory page can make it buckle. The fact that it takes considerably less time for me to load in one of my first saves compared to my near final saves is evidence enough of that. To say nothing as to the times when you have a massive amount stored back home, decide to dump it onto the nearest shopkeeper, and it takes multiple seconds to shift-click one item. Because I suspect it's using one of C-Sharp's standard list objects, and is having to reset the position of dozens if not hundreds of objects each time. And that's before I mention that the crafting system makes this even worse, because each individual sword could theoretically have a whole myriad of modifications to it, which means you can't just have one object to reference a short sword's damage. You have to choose between either having an object for every short sword you pick up, or find a way to dynamically create new objects to reference when this particular short sword has deviated from the norm. The former makes your save files and active memory look like an overstuffed bookcase, but the latter is much harder to program and would by nature be far more error-prone. My suspicion is that they went with the former, due to everything I mentioned, and the fact that, let's be honest, this is Obsidian we're talking about. Show me an Obsidian game that worked flawlessly on release, and I'll show you the second coming of Christ. Still, since I've mentioned the crafting system a couple of times, I should go into detail on that. It's not something that I interacted with a whole lot, but if you're someone who loves min-maxing, you have a limited ability to improve your equipment. Some materials will be found as you're wandering through an area, while others require you to kill a certain enemy to retrieve them. The system doesn't allow you to outright create weapons, as that's not something you really need to do with the glut of loot you can earn, but it does give you an opportunity to augment the weapons you do have, such as giving it more accuracy and damage, a bonus to a given attribute, extra elemental damage, and so on. As another neat addition, your adventures eventually lead you to an old keep called Cad Nua, which you get to slowly improve and use as a home base. Beyond just the shopkeepers you can attract to the place, you'll sometimes get side quests from there. Some of them will be a matter of addressing a local concern, with your responses affecting how people approach you in future conversations. Others ask you to send a party member far afield to take care of another matter, which leaves them indisposed for a while but earns you some experience and unique items for the trouble. Both of these help to expand on the world building while also grounding your character within it. And while it might not be a substantial portion from a gameplay standpoint, they offer a neat bit of variety whenever one shows up. On that note, let's move on to discussing the main event in more detail. Welcome to the world of Aora, a medieval fantasy setting where reincarnation exists. But because magic is also present, it's possible for those who are fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate, to peer into the essence and history of a soul. This one facet of the world building has the most profound effects on the story, as there are many an ethical question raised from such research. As for where in the world you are, the story takes place in the Deerwood, a young nation that successfully rebelled against the Adir Empire over a century ago, and as such is filled with danger and opportunity in equal measure. This is where your self-insert arrives, someone who can hail from any number of places and any number of professions depending on the choices you make at character creation, with these having minor effects on dialogue throughout the game. As a quick detail, there's an option you can toggle that will let you know when your character does and doesn't meet requirements for specific dialogue, meaning if you don't want to know that there's an option locked away behind being a certain class or having a particular attribute score, that's something you have complete control of. Getting back on topic, your self-insert finds himself in a trading caravan heading to the Deerwood, though your caravan would end up in danger, which gives the game a convenient way to deliver the tutorial. Near the end of this ordeal, you are witness to a strange ritual in some ancient ruins, as 3 men give up their lives for a cause you know nothing about, and you are left somehow changed as a result. Your search for answers leads you to a town called Gilded Vale, and while there, you learn that over the course of your misadventure that you have become a Watcher, one who is able to peer into the history of a soul. This is something which could be to your benefit, but due to the vivid visions this gives you and the history your own soul has been through, there is a possibility that such power could drive you insane. Thus, you set out, looking to make something of yourself while trying to understand your newfound condition, all in the backdrop of a country stricken by a terrible affliction of its own. In case all of the names and the focus on souls hasn't made it obvious, the world building is fantastic. Even though our travels seldom, if ever, take us outside of the Deerwood, our party is comprised of people who hail from across Aora, with some nations having significant influence on how events play out. By virtue of that, it does a good job at establishing a living, breathing world that's fertile ground for storytelling. The focus on souls and how they can be influenced remains front and center, with it touching the lives of many throughout the world. Just within your party, you have one searching for the soul of an elder who has passed away, another whose soul's condition leads to a split personality of sorts, and another whose work deals closely with childbirth, and to a larger problem within the Deerwood. To that end, the primary story thread beyond your own plight is a matter called Widewind's Legacy, where after the death of someone claiming to be Eothas, the god of renewal and light, children are being born without a soul. They weren't physically unhealthy, but lacking a soul leads them to be effectively stillborn, which has caused a lot of social upheaval across the country. It's a matter which you end up caught in the middle of, as your own plight will inevitably lead you into contact with animancers, those who dedicate their lives to studying the soul. The cause of the legacy is unknown, however, as answers could range from divine punishment, something to do with the actions of animancers, or something entirely unrelated. What makes all this even better is that the game ensures your actions have a direct effect on how the story plays out, which then affects how others treat you. As you complete quests and interact with others, how you choose to speak and the results of your actions will lead you to build up a certain reputation, which will then influence how people approach you. If you make the lives of a criminal family difficult, you may end up being ambushed by them at some point. If you spend your time working for one group, another may look at you with distrust, which bars certain quest lines and services. There was a broken weapon I found in the tunnels underneath Cad Nua, but because of story decisions I had made, I inadvertently barred the only way I know of to repair the weapon. Not that I needed it, considering all the fancy equipment you can get in this game, but little things like that go a long way to maintain the suspension of disbelief. However, there are some drawbacks of this being a cRPG, specifically with respect to time constraints. Given that the game lets you tackle quests in whatever order you like, there's little guarantee for when you'll be encountering certain events or how quickly you wish to address them. This can then lead the game balance to be thrown out of whack every now and then, with certain fights being easier or harder than intended. For instance, there's one questline you get almost as soon as you take possession of Cad Nua, where conflict has arisen to the north over a wizard's tower and a metric ton of mercenaries sent to besiege it. Attempt to fight those mercenaries as soon as you get the quest, and you'll rapidly find everyone in your party getting one-shot by an AoE spell. Even waiting until after I had finished up all of the White March DLC, I still had to engage in cheese to complete the final fight, by luring monsters out of a room and dealing with them in ways the developers probably didn't intend. At least the main story recognized all the experience I got from the DLC and gave me the option to ensure those fights continued to be a challenge, though this didn't have an effect on side quests. With respect to the story, the lack of time constraints can also undercut the tension of a given scene. The most extreme example of this was near the start of the White March DLC, where you arrive right in time to help repel an ogre attack. After dealing with said ogres, there's a building on fire and a couple of people trapped inside, with you having the ability to rescue both of them if you have the right spells and/or pass enough attribute checks. When I hit this point, and found out from my livestream chat that both people could be saved, I spent a long time digging through my inventory trying to min-max my way through the skill checks. After bashing my head against the wall looking through consumables and equipment though, a thought occurred to me. This is a cRPG. What was to stop me from going back to Cad Nua, getting an attribute increase from resting there, and then coming back? Sure, the game says it's a day's journey from there to the village I'm in right now, but would the game resolve the event if I just walked away? As it turned out, the answer was no. The fire was still going by the time I got back, as if it had been frozen in time. Moments like this might make for amusing stories in hindsight, but they don't do the game any favors in terms of immersion. Even if there are moments like that which can't easily be decoupled from the nature of a cRPG, the writing itself is stellar. I have made no secret that I really like Chris Avellone as a writer. There's a number of reasons for it, but the most basic reason is the way he writes descriptions. Given that this is a cRPG, where all you have to work with visually is a small character model, you're often given a short description of a character's appearance, body language, and facial expression. Said descriptions are really vivid, creating a clear sense of what a character is like even before any words are spoken. It's like I'm reading one of the old fantasy novels my parents have collected over the years, but without the pacing grinding to a halt when you have to deal with a massive banquet where every single detail of every single character's clothing has to be spelled out in bold font. Seriously, I get why those are important, as how characters present themselves can be crucial information, but surely there's a more organic way to address it. With a cRPG though, you're usually only dealing with one or two characters at a time, with descriptions only interspersed when they're directly relevant to the character you're speaking to. As a result, the conversation always stays on topic, and it's very easy to envision how a character will respond to what you say. Thanks to that writing style, the moment I started, it was like I was playing Planescape Torment again, which may be the highest praise I can offer a cRPG. Another reason why I like his writing is that the conflicts we're presented with usually aren't a matter of good versus evil, but of differing perspectives. A good example of this is toward the start of the game, right as you're approaching Gilded Vale. Once you're close by, you see a man who appears shaken by something, who warns you not to go to a cave in the north, lest you share the fate of his friend who got mauled by a bear. Being the skilled gamer that I am, I naturally ignored that warning, which meant I got my butt kicked and waited for quite a long time to actually go back up there and show it what's what. Eventually I run into the man in town, as well as the dead man's wife, and the dialogue notes how the two of them seem to be in surprisingly high spirits considering what had just happened. So when I went to take on the bear, imagine my shock to find the dead man's body, and a lingering soul that I as a watcher could interact with, whose memory suggested that the bear may have done the deed, but only because of an opportunity provided when his so-called friend slashed his leg with a dagger. Going back to confront the two, you come to find that the dead man was no saint, having a horrible temper and taking out that temper on his wife. When you hear that, you're at a crossroads. You're offered money to let them go and can choose how you wish to respond. Do you take the money, seeing it as a fair deal? Do you deny it, but let them go anyway, either telling them off or acting out of compassion? Do you attempt to turn them in for their own crime, or attempt to mete out justice for it yourself? It's a curious situation whose answer will depend on how much weight that you personally place on both parties' actions. At the risk of dating this video, this interaction is also a perfect example of something that's been on my mind for a while, specifically the nature of how we discuss serious subject matter within entertainment. For the past few years, there's been a considerable push by critics and activists to try and give more airtime to serious topics, as with how much time we spend with our entertainment, it's only natural that someone would wish to use it as a vehicle for something important. However, there's been a lot of pushback, as the attempts to add such topics have often been very ham-fisted or lazy, with modern political issues that will only data work being put in with all the nuance of a sledgehammer. Because of this, the message is often poorly received due to it compromising some aspect of the story, be it the tone, internal consistency, characterization, or any other aspect you can think of. Once that negative feedback is received, however, due to how personal serious topics can become, the critique is often interpreted not as a judgment of the work, but as a judgment of the person who created the work, and as a judgment of those beliefs, which then lead to character attacks and accusations that are seldom accurate. However, if you are going to be making a push for more serious topics to be broached, cases like what I just highlighted are a perfect way to handle it. There's no point where the game tells you the quote right answer or invokes a lecture about how terrible one side or another is. It simply presents the situation and gives you the freedom to assess it as you see fit. In doing so, you're given a case where you're forced to think on how you would act, and are shown what your choices cause in a consequence-free environment, at least with respect to the real world. To bring us back to the game, this particular instance is a messy situation that leaves a lot of room for nuance. On one hand, the murdered man was an abusive bastard by their account. On the other hand, the means by which he was killed is cruel and unusual, being left to die at the claws of a bear. Knowing this, do you believe that you're being told the truth? Do you believe that's a fair sentence? Do you believe they were in the right to carry out the sentence? And how do you approach the topic with them in general? It's a really fascinating moral conundrum with believable outcomes no matter which path you take. What makes this game so compelling is that it's littered with these conundrums, with there being tons of interesting results depending on the choices you make. Whether it be the possible shifts in perspective within your party members, or what you do along the path of tracking down the one who made you a watcher, the game allows you many opportunities to place yourself in a situation and seriously contemplate it. To further ensure that these work, I've had a hard time finding a plot hole, which is further impressive considering the ways that the story can diverge. To go into more detail, the fate of the Deerwood and the paths your party members take when the game is finished are directly affected by how you interact with them. I've only played through the game once, though I've got enough save files from throughout my adventure to explore different dialogue options. Based on that, and after looking up the possible endings online, it's not hard to picture how certain outcomes would have arisen, with there being very few cases where there wasn't an option I wish existed. Well, at least one that wasn't locked behind a skill check or background detail, but that's beside the point. The primary exception to this is the main story thread, as no matter what options you choose, you will find yourself along a certain path. Even there, however, the writing ensures that we have ample reason to follow through on that. With the inciting incident, and the threat of our past life's memories driving us mad, it becomes necessary that we follow through, if only for the sake of self-preservation. That then means no matter the personality type of our self-insert or the journey taken to reach that point, the point will indeed be reached. Although, even then, you can end up with some amusing details, as after getting a new monitor, I had switched to playing the game in windowed mode, and kept running into trouble where my cursor wouldn't stay within the window, with this sometimes occurring after an area had finished loading in. In cases like that, I sometimes would have odd buttons pressed as I was trying to alt-tab in and out to fix it, which accidentally led me to kill a main quest giver, which triggered an ending in the middle of Act 2 where events did not go well for me. It's not as if they've thought of everything, as there's a point in the spoiler section I'll be highlighting which I wish was handled better, but for the most part, you won't have immersion broken by the writing. With the writing and main story in good shape, all that needs to be seen to now is the presentation before giving a conclusion and delving into spoilers. With this being a game meant to recreate the look and feel of the Infinity Engine, the visuals and UI naturally match that. I've discussed the UI enough for the sake of this video, but what's also worth mentioning is the artwork, as it is gorgeous. To my knowledge, what we see is actually a series of 2D drawings that 3D models exist on top of, which would explain the locked perspective and the attention to detail on everything. Rendering all of this would have been taxing had it all been 3D, but when you make it 2D and cordon off elements that characters should move underneath, it makes the game run more efficiently at the expense of locking the perspective, which, considering the look and feel they were going for, is an appropriate compromise. The music is also really nice. I'm not familiar with the composer, but the orchestral soundtrack does a lot to add to the atmosphere. The combat music isn't my favorite, but with how much time I've spent with cRPGs over the last few years, it would be hard-pressed to match the intensity you get from those games. If there is one standout among the soundtrack though, it's a song you hear in the White March DLC.
The sea beheld her love, shining bright from on high.
When I heard this for the first time, I was in shock. A lot of music made for medieval fantasy can sometimes nail the instrumentation you would hear back in the day, but this is the closest I've seen a video game attempt to match what music sounded like back then. To go into more detail, my father really likes medieval European history, to where we would frequently go to our local Renaissance fair, as well as meet up with people who did fencing and other sword fighting that was as faithful to the period as possible. Since my family is also musically inclined, that also meant spending a lot of time listening to music either ripped straight out of the time period or was done in the same style. I never would have expected to hear that kind of mimicry in a video game, and yet it shows up in the most fitting place possible within the setting, and I could not be happier to hear it. With respect to voice acting, everyone involved does a good job. As with most cRPGs, the entire game isn't voiced, which means what's there is reserved for combat dialogue and important scenes to the central narrative and characters. Not only does it help distinguish the characters in moments that we should be paying close attention to, it adds a lot to the descriptions given. Of course, whenever I talk about voice acting now, I'm contractually obligated to note how insular the English voice acting scene appears to be. It's something I've mentioned elsewhere, so I won't belabor the point too much, but as I've spent more time with modern games, I've been hearing familiar voices a hell of a lot more often. Where this game is concerned, almost every party member in the base roster has done work for a Fire Emblem game, which isn't the most impressive feat given how many characters exist for the franchise, but considering my investment therein, that creates quite the tonal shift in my mind. I can't begrudge studios for banking on reliable talent, or said talent taking whatever gig they can get to pay the bills, but there's only so many times you can hear a familiar voice before it goes from an amusing novelty to an immersion-breaking distraction. With respect to this game, there were admittedly a few voices I didn't recognize at first, as while Matt Mercer's acting for a party member named Adair was instantly recognizable, I had to go digging to realize that he also voiced another party member named Aloth, and was the voice I chose for my self-insert. And before someone comments, "Tell me you don't watch Critical Role without telling me you don't watch Critical Role." Nothing against the show or actors, I just prefer to engage in shenanigans rather than watch them. Even so, there were a decent number of recognized voices, to where depending on my party arrangement, it's like I was watching Crom and Hector have a casual conversation while Edelgard gives them the cold shoulder, which, to be fair, isn't entirely out of character. It's a very subjective complaint, and I wouldn't know how best to address it even if I could objectively declare it a problem, but it's something that I do wonder about. With all of that said, that wraps up my thoughts on the story and presentation. Before we move on to spoilers though, I think it makes sense to give my overall conclusion now. With that in mind, Pillars of Eternity was perhaps the best game I could have chosen to introduce me to modern cRPGs. After having explored the Infinity Engine games, going to something that puts a modern spin on it was a breath of fresh air, as between the quality of life improvements, a rule set that's beholden to gameplay instead of the other way around, and a world that was absolutely fascinating to explore, this was right up my alley. It's not without flaws, such as the noticeable performance hit when your inventory fills up with useless junk, the game balance having the same eccentricities you'd expect from a cRPG, and real-time with pause continuing to test my patience, but when you've got a solid writing team with a fleshed out world to toy with, it's really nice to see it all come to fruition. If you're used to modern cRPGs and despise real-time with pause, I doubt this will be the one to convince you, but if you can push past it, you'll find a story and worlds that are well worth exploring. With that said, that's where our discussion shall end as far as avoiding spoilers is concerned. For those of you who have yet to play it, I strongly encourage you to check it out before going any further. Though I suppose I can't stop you from sticking around. You're likely gonna be lost, as I'm going to be acting on the assumption that you know certain things like key plot points and characters, but I suppose time will tell in that respect. Either way, let's not waste any time and get right to it. With how much there is to explore in this game, a full breakdown could lead us to be here for literal hours if we so desired. Not that I'm not above doing that, but for the sake of brevity, I'll be focusing on a small selection of key events. To that end, let's start by addressing the elephant in the room, the claim made by Ovara that there are no gods. This one claim, if true, completely recontextualizes everything within the story. On the surface, it seems impossible. If the gods weren't real, what was the driving force for the WoW quest? Who was I speaking to in the White March DLC and in Ter Everen? And how have all of these encounters lined up exactly with the descriptions of the gods by literally everyone we've interacted with? To see whether it holds water, let's start with Yovara's account. According to what she learned, the Inquithans faced a serious dilemma. Throughout their interactions with other civilizations, each one had a god or pantheon of gods that they claimed to fight for. Since these clashing beliefs led to numerous wars, and that they couldn't all be simultaneously correct, the Inquithans dedicated themselves to search for the true gods, the ones whom could be considered the creators of Aora. It was a search that lasted generations, and contributed greatly to their understanding of the soul, but it was a search that would end in failure. If there was a progenitor god or progenitor pantheon, it had long departed the world it created. What troubled the Inquithans most is what would happen if others followed in their footsteps, if they were to discover the secret. If there was no higher power, nothing beyond this life besides the next cycle of reincarnation, there would be those who would see no reason to live virtuously in the here and now, leading inevitably to chaos and tyranny. Once we defeat Theos, we get to see through his eyes what their solution was. If there were no higher powers that others could turn to as a moral center, then they would use what they had learned to create them. In the same way that we saw at the beginning of the game, nearly the totality of the Inquithan people willingly offered their souls as a sacrifice to the Adra device within Sun and Shadow, allowing them to literally create the pantheon that we've interacted with. The few who remained would live the rest of their lives as missionaries, spreading their faith and making it ubiquitous throughout Teora, the secret dying with them as they explicitly avoided marriage. Though they also presumably destroyed their souls so that they couldn't reawaken to this truth, even if it's never explicitly stated, but never mind me. So now that we've established what the game tells us, we come to an important question. Given everything we know, does this logically follow, and are there any alternatives to this idea? To answer the first question, it recontextualizes what Theos is doing as a means to try and prevent others from following the same path as the Inquithans did, to stay the world's hand when it comes to the very research into the soul that was mastered in their pursuit of the Creator Pantheon. We had already known the Leaden Key sees animancy as an evil, a fact that's reflected in Naloth's perspective, but this gives us a concrete reason for why beyond religious platitudes. The Inquithans' discovery would be harder to find now due to the presence of their created pantheon, but that's where Theos' other aim comes into play. By causing Widewind's legacy, he can lead the populace to believe animancy was the cause while also empowering one who is keen on keeping the secret hidden. With the second creation story also explaining how Theos' plan could even empower his goddess to begin with. This explanation could also outline why Widewind seems so out of character in relation to what Eothas represents, namely light and redemption. A war fought on his behalf may prompt a rebirth of sorts, but such a violent display would be more fitting for Barath or Maugren, with the latter made clear given that it was by her power that the God Hammer was forged. And yet, if Eothas were a created being instead of a being strictly representing those concepts, it may be possible to err, in the same manner as the people that created him. And yet, if the goal was to avoid needless religious wars, to give people a unified belief, then some of the choices made were strange ones, at least on the surface. Why would a god like Skane, devoted to hatred and resentment, be allowed to exist, especially when the horrid acts of his worshippers is made evident to Deerford? To that end, an answer, however morbid, can still be found. When you confront Theos, he describes how maintaining the Great Lie is more important than anything, even when it means demolishing a kingdom at peace by killing its benevolent and beloved ruler. Whatever Theos and the Inquithans saw, it's driven Theos to such a degree that he was willing to commit what would be, in our perspective, horrible atrocities far outstripping whatever Skane's disciples could conjure. If this is the one who maintains the Leaden Key, the one ultimately responsible for maintaining the secret, if this is what he was willing to commit to, then Skane by comparison is little more than an exit valve for those who would otherwise commit to something far worse. Perhaps most importantly of all, Theos never refutes Yovara's claim, at least not entirely. He does say that the gods are real, but he never says that they weren't created. In that sense, this is one place where the writing isn't as strong, as there isn't a chance for our dialogue options to clarify a difference between a creator pantheon and a created pantheon, which is where the primary issue seems to lie with Yovara. In that respect, Yovara and Theos are using different definitions for the term God, with Theos seeing it as any immortal being or ideal, while Yovara seems to narrow that onto a divine entity that was creator rather than created. Because the game doesn't let you pry into that distinction, an uncharitable interpretation could say that he answered the question as you asked it, in a rare case where I wish we had the means to further clarify. We get to see what happens from Theos' memory directly afterward, so it's not a grievous error, but it's something I wish we could have prodded him on. That said, if we were to look at this exchange charitably, for someone as intelligent and calculating as Theos, what they don't say is just as important as what they do say. It is clear that there is a pantheon now, but since he never refutes Yovara when it comes to where that pantheon comes from, we can safely assume it's true. Before we get too far along though, there is one interpretation I've seen expressed about the nature of the gods, and that's the possibility that they weren't created so much as born out of the faith of the Inquithans in the ideals they were to represent, ideals they were willing to die for. In this interpretation, the gods are only as real as the faith of their believers, which is how so many different civilizations from across Eora were able to claim divine authority. Given that this is a world of magic, in this perspective, their very will caused their god or gods to manifest, an idea which seems to be supported by the Maugren statue quest at Defiance Bay. If this were the case, however, it would theoretically become much harder for the remaining Ingwithans to proselytize about their own pantheon, as while the collective faith of the sacrificed Ingwithans would imbue a lot of power behind their claims, it would likely require more manipulation to spread the idea than is described, as you'd have to convert that power into something that could overwhelm active believers in other gods, believers who, by the Ingwithan account, were willing to fight and die on behalf of their beliefs just as much as the Ingwithans were. To further hamstring matters, it would also mean the nature of the Ingwithan gods could change over time, which would be difficult to prevent and may end up leading to the same or similar problem as before, with people fighting over the interpretation of the gods and everyone's different understanding of them leading to conflicting stories. Given how closely our interactions with the gods line up with the stories, that kind of precision would be difficult to maintain over the years, even with Theos and the Leaden Key pulling the strings behind the scenes. Because of that, I think it makes more sense that the gods were created from the collective strength of the sacrificed Ingwithans. With the foundation in good shape, that then means the game gets to do what it does best, present a fascinating conundrum for us to ponder. How exactly do we proceed now that we know the truth? On one hand, regardless of whether these are the true gods as it were, they are still powerful entities that hold some dominion over Eora, and that is something that has to be reconciled with. There are also those whose faith gives them direction, allowing them to persevere in times when individual strength doesn't seem to be enough, as well as those who, without the threat of angering a god, would commit horrible atrocities. There's also a question of what blowing the lid on this secret would entail. If it were possible for the Ingwithans to create their own pantheon, then what was to stop someone else from replicating the success of their work, especially when the tools were still usable? They may be well guarded, but as Theos demonstrates before we arrive in Twin Elms, well guarded does not equal impervious. And yet, is it right to lie to people about what they believe in? Is it right to tell people that everything will be okay if they latch their faith onto beings who cannot, by definition, be omniscient, who seem to cause suffering of their own? The Ingwithans certainly believed it would be too much, but after staring at the problem for so long, after burdening themselves with the secret, could they have been misguided? In the absence of religious belief, people will still find ways to identify themselves, to give their lives meaning. We can certainly argue about the value of said meaning, and the fact that conflict over differing beliefs and value systems is inevitable, but the choice the Ingwithans made was to take that choice away, to try and eliminate that conflict at its source. Out of fear of what they learned, they effectively ground intellectual evolution to a halt, with Theos continuing to hamstring it to this day. Instead of creators who crafted the world in their own image, we have a pantheon whose existence was meant to deify particular virtues that were devised post hoc, a path that may cause more suffering down the line if the virtues prove incomplete, as our understanding of ourselves stagnates. Is the secret so radioactive, the consequences so dire that it justifies shackling everyone in Eora to a singular belief? And thus, you are set to ponder these, to consider how you would act, to mull over how your actions up to now may influence your companions as you all go your separate ways. And in the end, there is no judgment for which path you take, only people doing their best to reconcile with the world around them. To bring it all together, you have a fantastic villain with Theos. Right from our first chance meeting in the Ingwithan ruins and in every subsequent meeting and flashback, he is an imposing presence, which is carried excellently by strong voice acting and the stoic portrait. The game doesn't just say that he's a serious threat, he demonstrates that through his actions, slipping out of your grasp at the sanitarium by means that you can't reasonably account for, and then using that same power to destabilize Defiance Bay as a whole. Even someone as cunning as Lady Webb only seems to live because he doesn't see her as a threat, only bothering to kill her after Duke Avar is dead. Every action he takes, every word out of his lips speaks to his determination, his unbreakable will to see his mission through, to ensure that the secret is maintained, to ensure that Boudica is strengthened further, all to see to the success of that mission. There is no compromise, there is no argument, as when you meet him, he verbally tears into your companions, attempts even as he knows what is to come to make you see what is in his mind the error of your ways. And behind it all is the knowledge that he has the power to accomplish his aim, making him an imposing threat even when he's off screen. And in the end, even if he must be stopped for the injustice he's caused the Deerwood and to countless other civilizations, the choice remains. Do you end his existence permanently? Is he enough of a threat that allowing him to return to the wheel with his memory intact would be a mistake? Or do you believe that banishing him to the same place as Yovara is a fitting punishment for all that he's done? Even after he's been seen to, what to do with the souls that remain? Cast aside any control you have by appeasing Weil and let fate see to the rest? Strengthen those who remain? Or perhaps restore those who can be? Or even if you may have disagreed with Theos' methods, perhaps you agree with his sentiment and complete his task, strengthening Wootica and ensuring that the secret remains buried. Even as Theos forces us into this confrontation, the fate of the Dyrwood is left to us once it's been resolved. With as stellar as the writing is, though, the plot itself is the textbook definition of contrivance. Right as Theos is performing a ritual to ensure Weidman's legacy continues, we arrive on the scene knowing nothing about our soul's history, but eventually learning that we, whatever our current life's background, was one of his inquisitors. Not only is this the case, but somehow we live where our tutorial companions don't, and viewing the ritual not only leads our soul to awaken to that past life, but we're also given the powers of a Watcher, which makes us incredibly dangerous to Theos' ambitions. It's not without reason that this contrivance exists though. As mentioned earlier, having our soul's backstory be important gives us the freedom to create a personalized self-insert that will always have a reason to seek out Theos. Even beyond that customization, such a person is perhaps one of the only ones that can stop Theos, as he has had centuries of practice to keep his involvement in Kith affairs hidden. Even those who have been effective at either staying one step ahead or keeping under his radar like Lady Webb aren't quite fast enough to stay out of trouble forever, with our power as a Watcher the only reason we know where he's going. At this point, we have to ask if the contrivance is absurd enough that it breaks our immersion, which is where things become more subjective. Based on the fact that Yovara lived at the time of the Inquithan missionaries, it's safe to say that the Inquisition would have happened centuries ago, meaning there would be numerous generations, and by extension reincarnations, for our self-insert. Given what Theos said about the actions he's taken, it's possible that other moments could have caused this coincidence to occur as well. The real absurd luck for me is that the one former Inquisitor who does get awakened has directly interacted with Yovara, and depending on our dialogue choices, may have a personal connection with her. You could argue divine intervention, as Skane implies following your final confrontation with Theos, but that seems a little too coincidental for even the gods to have arranged. And as one final thing to discuss, I was able to find one point where the story isn't as strong in terms of internal consistency. For the most part, if there is a legitimate way to prevent an outcome, you are often given the means to accomplish it. Given that they had to consider all options for the sake of role-playing, and could lock events behind your character's statistics, it should be expected that pretty much everything has been thought up. However, there are rare points where the limits of a cRPG can sometimes impede that, with the example that comes to mind being the quest in Heritage Hills. Due to the activation of an Inquithan structure, one with a similar design to what you saw near the start of the game, the place has become overrun with vessels. Once you've identified the problem, you have two options to deal with it. You can shut it down, which has no immediate cost to anyone around you, or you can effectively set it to overload, destroying it alongside all of the souls that are currently bound within it. Not wishing to destroy the souls, my first choice was to simply shut it down. But because I was live streaming my playthrough, chat rightly pointed out that failing to destroy it meant that the let-in key who had activated the device once before could easily reactivate it once I was done. Given the chaos that I knew would likely spring up following the Animancy hearings, I couldn't guarantee that the device would be well guarded, especially if any of the lingering vessels ended up hamstringing what guards could be stationed near it. In that regard, it seemingly presented an upscaled trolley problem, where you have to choose whether to flip the lever to let one person die, or allow 5 others to die instead. Only this time, instead of 1 versus 5, it's hundreds versus thousands. At the time, this left me impressed, as my lack of foresight could have had serious consequences since this was a main story quest directly related to the main bad guy group. Since then, however, I can't help but wonder if there was another way to destroy the device without destroying the souls. After all, this is a world where colonial-era firearms exist, and even if the Audra built into the device would make it more resilient, that doesn't mean the copper and stone could necessarily withstand a primitive bomb or cannon. The only problem with trying to answer this is that there's a lot of ambiguity as a result of the game itself. It's unclear how dangerous the vessels are from a story perspective as opposed to a gameplay perspective, so we don't know if we could roll a cannon over to it, or get enough dynamite there to blow it up the easy way. Numerous gunshots or mace hits might eventually take it down, but that would be a time-consuming process when there's no guarantee that you can finish the job before being attacked by more vessels. I wish the option was there to try and destroy it another way, even if it involved drawing a lot of attention from either the let-in key or the vessels, but sadly, there's no confirmation one way or another, and that ambiguity makes the moral conundrum have less weight to it. When looking over the entire game though, it's hard not to appreciate just how much was done well. Putting aside the contrivances and the quirks of a cRPG, what's told here is a fascinating tale that gives you as the player a great deal of agency in how you wish to resolve the problems presented to you, with the fate of the Dyrwood and the fate of your companions sufficiently reflecting the decisions you make. As I said at the start of this video, it's rather fitting that this would be the game chosen as I start looking at modern takes on cRPGs, as after having thoroughly explored the Infinity Engine games, getting to see such a different world, getting to relive the same feeling I had playing through Planescape Torment, and getting to slowly chip away at the game over the course of a few months, it was an absolute treat, and I look forward to seeing what else the genre has in store for me. With that said, that's all I have for this video, and thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for more reviews as well as other content posted on a semi-regular basis. And honestly, it's about time I got this video sorted. I'd originally planned to shake up the visual component a lot, but I had trouble getting it to look the way I wanted to. And after a while, since it was holding things up more than I'm comfortable admitting, it made sense to keep things as they normally are. As for what's next when it comes to cRPGs, Baldur's Gate 3 is the obvious choice, though given how radically different the outcome for the story and characters can be, that's something I may want to wait on until I can play through it a couple more times. Instead, I've got a couple of older cRPGs I'm mulling over, and while I haven't committed to one yet, I'm sure the stream history on my other channels will say as much when the time comes. For now then, thank you all once again for watching, please let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you all later.